Nobody at Denver Metro Trauma Center saw past the worn scrubs and the quiet voice. To them, Sarah Whitfield was just the strange nurse the security chief loved humiliating in front of everyone. But when armed men stormed the hospital and a hidden bomb tore through the ER, one of the attackers froze the second he saw her face. Because he had seen that look before, in a war zone thousands of miles away, right before her team destroyed everything he had. Welcome to Secrets of Silent Badges. If you're new here, this channel tells the true-to-life stories of ordinary heroes hiding extraordinary pasts. Hit like if you believe some people carry more strength than the world ever gives them credit for. Comment below and tell me what city you're listening from tonight. And subscribe, because Sarah's story is only getting started. You don't belong in this hospital. Chief of Security Marcus Deal said it loud enough for the whole nurses' station to hear. Sarah Whitfield didn't answer. She kept her eyes on the chart in her hands. I asked you a question, Whitfield. You didn't ask anything, she said quietly. You made a statement. A few nurses laughed behind their hands. Deal's face went red. Cute. You know what I think? I think you're hiding something. 3 years here, and nobody knows a thing about you. No photos, no boyfriend, nothing. I like my privacy. People who like privacy that much usually have something to hide. Sarah set the chart down. Her shoulders stayed low, curved inward, the posture of someone who had spent 3 years making herself small. I have a patient in Bay 4, she said, and walked past him. Deal watched her go. It bothered him, the way she moved through chaos without ever raising her voice, without ever needing him. He didn't know what he was looking at. Nobody did. Denver Metro Trauma Center sat on the edge of downtown, a glass and steel building that swallowed the worst nights of people's lives and spat them back out, sometimes whole, sometimes not. Level 1 designation, 60 beds. On a Tuesday afternoon in late September, it ran at half capacity, everyone still moving fast just with room to breathe. Sarah moved through it like water through rock, taking the path of least resistance. In Bay 4, an elderly man named Harold Betts was recovering from a mild cardiac event. Vitals are stable, Sarah told his daughter. Heart rate's coming down. He'll be fine. Harold's eyes found hers. You've got a soldier's hands, he said. Steady. My brother had hands like that. Vietnam. Sarah's jaw tightened, just slightly. I'm just a nurse. Sure, Harold said, smiling like he didn't believe her at all. She adjusted his drip rate and moved on before the conversation could go further. Years of training herself out of the posture that gave her away. The scan of every room for exits. The way her eyes catalogued threats before her brain caught up. And still, old men in cardiac recovery saw straight through her. She found the supply closet empty and allowed herself 30 seconds. Just 30. Eyes closed. Breath in for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The box breathing that had kept her alive in worse rooms than this one. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her scrubs, and went back to work. Bright, vivid cobalt blue. Her scrubs. Standard issue for the trauma floor. She'd learned to disappear inside the color, inside the uniform, inside the role, inside. Nobody looked twice at a quiet nurse in blue scrubs. That was the whole point. By 4 in the afternoon, the ER had filled with the usual Tuesday mix. A broken wrist from a bicycle accident. A child with a fever that had her mother in tears. A construction worker with a nail through his palm, cursing in Spanish and English in equal measure. Sarah worked through it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. And if her supervisor, Dr. Renata Alvarez, noticed the way Sarah's eyes flicked to the ambulance bay doors every time they opened, she never said anything about it. You ever going to tell me where you learned to start a central line that fast? Doctor, Alvarez had asked her once, after Sarah placed a line in a crashing patient in under 90 seconds. Nursing school, Sarah said. Nursing school doesn't teach that. Good nursing school does. Alvarez let it go. She always did. She was one of the few people at Denver Metro who understood some doors were better left closed. Marcus Deal was not one of those people. He found her again near the medication room, arms crossed, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights like he thought it made him someone. Corporate's doing a security review next month, he said. Full background checks, all staff. Sarah's stomach tightened, but her face stayed flat. That's not my department. Everything here is my department. He leaned closer. Your employment record starts 3 years ago, Nothing before that. Almost like you didn't exist before you walked through those doors. I moved around a lot, military family. Funny, you never mention which branch. You never asked nicely. He smiled, thin and unpleasant. I will find out what you're hiding, one way or another. Good luck with that, she said, walking away before he could see her hands curl briefly into the shape they made before a strike. She hated him. Not for the cruelty, though the cruelty was real. She hated him because every word out of his mouth was a crowbar aimed at the seams of the life she'd built. She pulled her sleeve down over the thin shrapnel scar on her left forearm, an old reflex, and rubbed her thumb once across the faint chemical burn scar on her inner wrist, a habit that surfaced whenever her hands went idle for too long. 12 years, a Navy SEAL. Senior Chief Petty Officer. 200 direct action missions across 3 theaters and 1 operation in the Horn of Africa she would not talk about. Could not talk about without her hands starting to shake. 4 names. She still said them sometimes, quietly, in the shower, where the water covered the sound. Reyes. Kowalski. Dunmore. Petrov. 4 families who got folded flags instead of husbands and fathers, because she'd made a call on a rooftop in Djibouti that seemed right at the time and turned out catastrophically wrong. She'd left the teams 18 months later. Nobody pushed her out. She walked away from 12 years of identity because she couldn't look at another young operator without hearing the radio call that came 4 seconds too late. Nursing school had been an accident, almost. A way to keep her hands busy, while the rest of her figured out how to keep breathing. It turned out she was good at it. The same hands that had run a breach team through hostile buildings could read a crashing patient's vitals faster than the monitors could catch up. She told herself it was penance. She never told anyone that. The afternoon wore on. The construction worker got his hand stitched and sent home with antibiotics. The child's fever broke under a dose of ibuprofen and a lot of reassurance to a very worried mother. The bicycle accident got a cast and a lecture about helmets. At 6:15, Sarah took her break in the stairwell, the one place nobody else seemed to use. She sat on the 3rd landing and let herself, for 10 minutes, be nobody at all. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister in Ohio. Thanksgiving this year? Mom's asking. She typed back, I'll try. She always tried. She never went. Family gatherings meant questions, and questions meant lies. The elevator chimed somewhere below, a small sound, and something in the base of her skull went quiet and alert at once, the way it did when a sound didn't fit the building's rhythm. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself that a lot these days. She checked her watch and went back down to the floor. The ER hummed along through the evening the way it always did, ebbing and flowing with the city's small disasters. Sarah moved through triage, through the medication room, through a dozen small kindnesses that nobody would remember by morning, holding a scared teenager's hand while a doctor set her broken arm, telling a frightened father in halting Spanish that his infant daughter's fever was nothing serious, just a virus, she would be fine by morning. At 9 p.m., Marcus Deal walked the perimeter of the ER like he always did, checking badges, checking faces, making himself visible in that particular way small men made themselves visible when they wanted to feel important. He stopped at the nurse's station where Sarah was charting. Loading dock camera's been glitching again, he said, to nobody in particular, though his eyes were on her. Might need maintenance in there tonight. Not my department, Sarah said without looking up. No, Deal agreed. It's not. He walked away, and Sarah went back to her charting, and neither of them noticed the gray panel van that had been parked across the street from the loading dock for the last 40 minutes, engine off. 4 men inside it who had not moved and had not spoken, and were watching the hospital shift change with the patience of people who had done this kind of thing before. Neither of them noticed the 5th man, sitting in the passenger seat, who had a photograph on his phone screen that he kept glancing at. A grainy, still frame pulled from a hospital employee badge database that a corrupted insider had sold to his employer for $11,000. The photograph showed a woman in bright cobalt blue scrubs. Brown hair pulled back. Steel grey eyes looking slightly away from the camera, the way people do when they don't want their picture taken. The 5th man stared at that photograph for a long time. He knew that face. He had seen it once before, years ago, in a country that didn't officially exist on any operation he'd ever been paid for. In the half-second before his unit had been torn apart by a strike team that moved like ghosts, and left nothing behind but bodies and silence. He had a scar on his left forearm from that night, jagged and pale, a reminder etched into his skin by a woman he had never gotten a name for. Now he had a photograph. Now he had a name. Sarah Whitfield. He didn't know yet what it meant that she was here, working in scrubs in a Colorado trauma center like an ordinary person. But he intended to find out, and he intended to make her pay for what she'd taken from him, one way or another, before the night was over. At 9:40, the man in the passenger seat nodded once, and the driver started the engine, and the van pulled slowly around the block toward the loading dock, where a hospital badge cloned from stolen data would open a door that should have stayed locked. Inside, Sarah Whitfield finished a chart, straightened a stack of supply requisitions, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, a cold and familiar certainty settle into her spine. Something was wrong. She just didn't know what yet. She would know within the hour, and by then it would already be too late to stop what was coming, only to survive it, and to decide, in the space of a few violent minutes, exactly who she was willing to become again. The loading dock door hissed open at 9:53 p.m. 4 men in dark tactical gear moved through it in a tight column, weapons low and ready, faces covered by black balaclavas. They moved fast and quiet, the kind of quiet that came from training, not luck. A supply clerk looked up from his clipboard and had 1 second to register what he was seeing before a gloved hand clamped over his mouth. "Don't make a sound," a voice said, low and flat. "You go home tonight. You scream you don't." The clerk nodded and stayed silent. The 4 men fanned out through the receiving corridor with the ease of people who had studied the floor plan in advance. Somebody had given them very good information. In the security office, Marcus Deal sat with his feet up on the desk, watching a basketball game on his phone instead of the bank of monitors in front of him. The loading dock feed had been dark for the last 6 minutes, a maintenance glitch he'd already logged and forgotten about. He never saw the 4 men enter the building. He never saw the 5th man, the one with the scarred forearm, walk in through the front entrance 12 minutes later, dressed in ordinary street clothes, blending into the evening crowd of visitors and family members like he belonged there. His name was Alexei Rusev, formerly of a private military contracting outfit that appeared on no public registry, now employed by a man who wanted specific things from this hospital tonight, and who had promised Rusev a bonus if he could settle an old score along the way. Rusev walked through the main lobby, past the gift shop, past the information desk, and found a seat in the family waiting area near the ER, where he pulled out his phone and pretended to scroll through messages while he waited for the signal. At 10:02 p.m., the 4 men in tactical gear reached the hospital pharmacy, a locked and secured room on the 2nd floor that held, among other things, a substantial supply of fentanyl, ketamine, and other controlled substances with significant street value. As far as 3 of the 4 men understood it, this was the job. A pharmaceutical heist, quick and clean. Rusev knew better. He knew the pharmacy job was cover. He knew the real target sat in a different building entirely, 3 blocks away, where a federal witness under protective custody was scheduled for a minor outpatient procedure that had somehow, through channels his employer had spent considerable money to arrange, been rerouted to Denver Metro's trauma center instead. The witness's name was Daniel Cho, a former accountant for an organized crime syndicate who had agreed to testify against his former employers. He'd developed appendicitis 3 days into witness protection, and someone with access to protected medical routing systems had exploited it within hours. Cho was scheduled to arrive at 10:30 p.m. under a false name, accompanied by 2 marshals, for what his file listed as a routine appendectomy consult. He was the reason 4 armed men were breaching a pharmacy as a distraction, and the reason Alexei Rusev sat quietly in a waiting room chair with a syringe hidden in his jacket pocket. Sarah Whitfield knew none of this. She only knew that the hair on the back of her neck had not settled since the elevator chime in the stairwell, and that 12 years of training did not simply switch off because she wanted them to. At 10:11 p.m., the pharmacy alarm went off. It was a soft alarm, designed to alert security without panicking patients, a discreet chime that most staff wouldn't even register as unusual. Marcus Deal's phone buzzed with the alert, and he glanced at it, annoyed, assuming a malfunction. The same kind of glitch that had taken out the loading dock camera earlier. He walked toward the pharmacy at a leisurely pace, still holding his phone, still half watching the basketball game, and did not draw his weapon, did not call for backup. did not do any of the things a competent security chief would have done in that situation. Because Marcus Deal had gotten his job through a cousin who sat on the hospital board and had never in his life faced a real threat that didn't involve an angry family member yelling at a front desk. He rounded the corner into the pharmacy corridor and walked directly into the barrel of an assault rifle. "Down," the voice behind the balaclava said. "Now." Deal's phone clattered to the floor. He dropped to his knees, hands raised, face the color of old paper. "Please, I don't—" "Shut up," the man said, and zip-tied his hands with brutal efficiency. Down the hall, the first scream started. A nurse who'd stepped out of a supply room and found herself facing 4 armed men in the middle of a robbery in progress. The scream traveled through the hospital's second floor like electricity through water, and within seconds, the entire trauma center's rhythm shattered. Sarah Whitfield was adjusting an IV drip in Bay 6 when the scream reached her, distant but unmistakable, a sound that every human nervous system recognizes instinctively as danger. Every other person on that floor froze, or flinched, or looked toward the sound with confused, frightened faces. Sarah's body did something different, something that had been trained into her so deeply that no amount of nursing school or grief or 12 months of court-mandated therapy could undo it. Her weight shifted onto the balls of her feet. Her eyes swept the room, cataloging exits, cover, improvised weapons in less than a second, the way water finds the low ground without thinking about it. She set down the IV bag she was holding very gently, so it wouldn't clatter, and looked at her patient, an 18-year-old with a broken ankle, wide-eyed and terrified in the hospital bed. "Stay down," Sarah said, her voice suddenly different, lower, flatter. Carrying an authority the girl had never heard from the quiet nurse who checked her vitals 20 minutes earlier. "Stay on the floor, away from the door, and don't make a sound. Do you understand me?" The girl nodded, too frightened to question why the nurse's whole demeanor had just changed in an instant. Sarah moved to the door of the bay and looked out into the hallway. Chaos. Patients and staff running, ducking into rooms, some frozen in place, some screaming. No visible shooters yet on this floor, which meant the threat was still upstairs, in the pharmacy corridor, but sound traveled fast in a building like this, and panic traveled faster. "Doctor." Alvarez appeared at the nurse's station, phone pressed to her ear, face pale. "Security says there's an active threat on 2, she said, loud enough for the ER staff to hear. "Everybody needs to shelter in place. Lock the doors you can lock. Get patients away from windows and hallways." Sarah's mind was already 3 steps ahead, running calculations that had nothing to do with nursing protocol and everything to do with 12 years of close-quarters battle training. Second-floor pharmacy. Multiple armed subjects, based on the volume and spread of the panic. A hospital this size, this time of night. Minimal on-duty security beyond an incompetent chief who probably hadn't drawn a weapon in anger in his entire career. This was not a random event. Pharmacies got robbed for drugs, sure, but this many shooters, this much noise, this fast, this had the shape of something bigger, something with a second objective hiding underneath the obvious one. She didn't know yet what that second objective was, but every instinct she'd spent 3 years trying to bury was screaming that there was one. "Dr. Alvarez," Sarah said, moving toward her with the kind of controlled urgency that made the doctor actually look at her, really look at her, for the first time in months. "We need to get ambulatory patients to interior rooms. Anyone in a bed near a hallway or window needs to move now, and we need to identify choke points, doors we can barricade if this comes our way." Alvarez blinked. "Choke points?" "Doors, hallway junctions, anywhere we can slow down anyone coming through if they come this way." "Sarah, this isn't... We're not equipped to..." "I know," Sarah said. "Just trust me on this. Please." Something in her voice made Alvarez stop arguing. She'd worked with Sarah for 3 years, had marveled privately at her competence more times than she could count, and had learned, on some instinctive level, that when this particular nurse's voice changed like this, it was worth listening. "Okay," Alvarez said. "Tell me what to do." Sarah moved through the ER in the next 90 seconds like a different person entirely, directing staff with quiet, precise instructions, moving patients away from sightlines, identifying the 2 doors that could realistically be barricaded, and assigning nurses to gather rolling supply carts and gurneys to reinforce them if needed. Nobody questioned her. In the vacuum of real leadership, in the absence of any competent security response, people simply followed the person who seemed to know what she was doing. And right now, That person was a quiet nurse named Sarah Whitfield, who had never raised her voice above a murmur in 3 years of employment. Marcus Deal, meanwhile, knelt zip-tied on the pharmacy floor, sweating through his uniform shirt, watching 4 armed men load duffel bags with controlled substances, while a 5th voice crackled through one of their radios, giving updates from somewhere else in the building. "Package secured," the radio voice said. "Moving to secondary objective." One of the men in the pharmacy glanced at his watch. 2 minutes, he said to the others. "Wrap it up." Deal didn't understand what secondary objective meant. He understood only the cold barrel pressed occasionally against his skull, a reminder to stay silent and still. He would understand later that his own incompetence, an unwatched monitor, an ignored alarm, 3 years of never once checking the one employee who might have stopped this, had opened a door that Sarah Whitfield was about to walk through alone. A black SUV pulled up to Denver Metro's main entrance at 10:28 p.m. 2 marshals stepped out, flanking a nervous man in his 40s who kept glancing over his shoulder. Daniel Cho had no idea the sky was already falling 2 floors above his head. Alexei Rusev rose from his seat in the family waiting area, tucked his phone into his jacket pocket, and walked toward the ambulance bay entrance with the unhurried gait of a man who had all the time in the world because in his mind, he did. He had waited years for a moment like this. A few more minutes changed nothing. He didn't know the woman on the badge photograph was 50 feet away, directing a hospital's defense with the same calm precision she'd once used leading a strike team through a compound in Djibouti. He would know soon. At 10:30 p.m. exactly, Daniel Cho stepped through the ambulance bay doors between his 2 marshal escorts, and the 5th objective of the night finally converged with the 4th. Rusev fell into step 20 feet behind them, unremarkable, invisible, another visitor in a building full of visitors. Inside, the radio in the pharmacy crackled again. "Secondary objective inbound. Converge on ER, North Corridor." The 4 armed men abandoned Marcus Deal where he knelt, zip-tied and shaking, and moved as a unit toward the stairwell, duffel bags of stolen narcotics slung over their shoulders, weapons still raised. They hit the ER's North Corridor at 10:32, moving fast, and the second wave of screaming started, louder and closer this time, close enough that Sarah felt the vibration of it in her chest before she consciously registered the sound. "They're coming this way," a young nurse named Priya said, voice cracking, backed against the nurse's station. Sarah was already moving. "Everyone down. Get behind the desk. Stay low," she said, and her voice had lost every trace of the quiet, careful nurse she'd spent 3 years pretending to be. The 4 men rounded the corner into the main ER bay, weapons sweeping the room, and found 40 terrified people crouched behind gurneys and desks and each other, and 1 woman standing. Sarah Whitfield stood in the center of the room, hands loose at her sides, weight balanced, eyes moving between all 4 men in a fraction of a second, reading angles, reading weapons, reading the spacing between them that told her which one was in charge and which ones were following. "On the ground!" the lead gunman barked, weapon raised toward her chest. Sarah didn't move. "There's a marshal detail 200 feet from here," she said, calm and clear. "You have maybe 90 seconds before this becomes a federal incident. I'd leave the way you came." The gunman hesitated, half a second, enough for Sarah to see the flicker of uncertainty behind his balaclava. "Who the hell are you?" "Nobody," Sarah said. "Just a nurse." His finger tightened on the trigger, and in that single heartbeat, everything she had spent 3 years suppressing came roaring back online, faster than thought. She had no weapon. She did what 12 years of training had built into her instead. She used the room. A crash cart sat 4 feet to her left. She'd clocked its position the moment she walked into the bay, a habit she'd never been able to unlearn. She shoved it hard into the lead gunman's knees, and in his half-second stumble, closed the distance and drove the heel of her palm into his jaw. He dropped instantly, weapon clattering free. The second gunman swung his rifle toward her. Sarah was already inside his range, wrist locked against the barrel and forced skyward as the weapon discharged into the ceiling, plaster raining down over fresh screaming. She twisted the rifle free and cracked the stock across his temple, dropping him beside the first. The third and fourth gunmen, seeing 2 of their own drop in under 6 seconds, hesitated. In close quarters combat, often the same thing as losing. "Federal officers, drop your weapons." The shout came from the corridor. 2 marshals, weapons drawn, moved into the bay with Daniel Cho shoved behind a support pillar for cover. The remaining 2 gunmen turned toward the new threat, And in that instant of divided attention, something detonated. It came from a duffel bag abandoned near the desk, a small improvised device, meant as insurance, meant to create chaos and cover retreat. The explosion was not large by the standards of the wars Sarah had fought in. In an enclosed bay full of civilians, it was catastrophic. The blast wave threw people from their feet, glass shattered, smoke and the acrid smell of burned chemicals filled the room. Somewhere in the chaos, a monitor alarm began shrieking its flatline tone. When the smoke began to clear, 4 people lay with visible injuries. One marshal was down, shrapnel in his thigh, blood pooling beneath him. Priya had been thrown into a supply rack, stunned but breathing. An elderly patient near the hallway had taken the worst of the blast, unconscious, chest rising in shallow gasps. And Daniel Cho, the man everyone had come for, lay against the support pillar, jagged metal buried deep in his abdomen, blood spreading across his shirt. The 2 surviving gunmen, disoriented by their own bomb, fled through the shattered doors, weapons abandoned, vanishing into a hospital going into full lockdown. Sarah was already moving toward Cho before the smoke had fully cleared. "I need trauma shears, chest seals, and every hand that can hold pressure now," she called out, voice cutting through the ringing silence left behind by the blast. And something in that voice made every conscious person in the room move to obey her without question. She dropped to her knees beside Cho and assessed in under 3 seconds. Rapid, thready pulse, skin cold and clammy. Blood loss significant but not yet catastrophic if she moved fast enough. "Sir, I need you to stay with me," she said, cutting his shirt open with the trauma shears someone had shoved into her hand. "You're going to be okay. I need you to look at me." Cho's eyes, glassy with shock, found hers. "Am I dying?" he whispered. "Not on my watch," Sarah said, and packed the wound with combat gauze in a motion so fast and so precise that Dr. Alvarez, arriving at a dead run with a crash team behind her, stopped dead in the doorway and simply stared. Sarah's hands moved with a fluency that had nothing to do with nursing school, kaolin gauze packed tight against the wound. Pressure applied at exactly the angle to control the bleed, her voice steady as she called out vitals like she'd done this 1,000 times, because she had. "BP's dropping. I need 2 large-bore IVs. Push fluids wide open, and get me a surgeon down here in the next 90 seconds or we lose him." Alvarez, still stunned, snapped into motion, barking orders to the crash team, and within a minute, Cho had 2 lines running and a surgical team sprinting toward the bay. Sarah moved to the wounded marshal next, checking for arterial involvement, applying an improvised pressure dressing that stopped the bleeding almost instantly. Her hands never shaking despite the ringing in her ears and the smoke still curling through the room. Only after the marshal was stabilized, after Cho was wheeled toward the OR, after the crisis had passed through her hands into the machinery of the hospital's trauma response, did Sarah allow herself to stand up straight in the wrecked bay and look around at the destruction. Every eye in the room was on her. Dr. Alvarez stood a few feet away, staring at her with an expression that mixed awe and something like fear. "Sarah," she said slowly, "where did you learn to do that?" Before Sarah could answer, before she could reach for one of the practiced deflections she'd used for 3 years, a voice spoke from the shattered doorway of the North Corridor, low and disbelieving, a voice with a faint accent that didn't belong to Denver. "Whitfield," the voice said. Sarah's whole body went cold and still. She turned and found a man in ordinary street clothes, standing amid the wreckage, a jagged scar visible on his forearm, a face she didn't consciously remember, but that her body recognized before her mind caught up. "I dreamed about your face for 3 years," he said. "I never thought I'd see it in a place like this." Every conscious person in the ruined bay turned between them, sensing this had nothing to do with the robbery, and everything to do with something that started long before tonight. "I don't know you," Sarah said, but her voice had lost its careful register, and what remained was flat and utterly without fear. "Yes, you do," the man said, pulling a syringe from his jacket. "Djibouti, the rooftop. You and your team, moving like ghosts. You took 4 of my brothers that night. Tonight, I take something from you." Dr. Alvarez stepped back, pulling frightened staff with her. "Somebody call security," she said, though everyone understood security had failed them hours ago. Sarah didn't move. "You have a syringe and a grudge," she said. I have a hospital full of witnesses and 4 seconds before every marshal in this building puts you on the ground. Walk away. I don't think so, the man said, and stepped toward her. Syringe raised, and for the first time in 3 years in front of dozens of witnesses. In the smoking wreckage of a hospital bay, Sarah Whitfield's disguise came apart completely, revealing exactly who she had spent 3 years pretending not to be. Rusev lunged with the syringe already falling toward her neck, and Sarah moved before conscious thought caught up to instinct. The same gap in time that had once separated her from 4 dead teammates and had haunted her for 3 years, except this time the gap worked for her instead of against her. She caught his wrist mid-strike, twisted hard enough to hear something pop in his forearm, and drove her knee into his ribs with a force that folded him forward and sent the syringe clattering across the tile floor, its contents spilling into a dark stain that no one would step near. Rusev went down hard, and Sarah followed him to the floor, knee planted between his shoulder blades. One arm wrenched up at an angle that made him scream through gritted teeth. "Who sent you?" she said. Not a question. A demand, low and level, delivered in a voice that carried the full weight of a training pipeline most people never survived. "You should be dead," Rusev spat, blood in his mouth from where his jaw had hit the floor. "All of you should be dead." "Wrong night for wishes," Sarah said, and looked up as the 2 marshals reached them, weapons still raised, faces caught somewhere between relief and confusion at what they were seeing. "Ma'am, step back. We've got him," the older marshal said, though his eyes lingered on her a half-second longer than the situation required, the way a professional's eyes linger on another professional they don't yet have a name for. Sarah rose, kept her weight balanced, and stepped back exactly as far as necessary and not an inch further. "He's former private military contracting," she said. "Eastern European accent, tactical vocabulary, trained response to restraint. He'll have handlers. Whoever sent him wanted the witness, and the pharmacy robbery was cover for the primary op." The younger marshal stared at her. "How do you know that?" Sarah didn't answer. She was already moving toward Cho's gurney, checking the marshal escort's pressure dressing, calling out instructions to the surgical team, wheeling him toward the elevator, her voice snapping back into clinical clarity like a switch had been thrown. Behind her, Dr. Alvarez stood frozen in the wreckage, staring at the woman she'd worked beside for 3 years, like she was seeing a stranger wearing a familiar face. "Sarah," she said again, quieter this time. "What are you?" Sarah didn't turn around. "Later," she said. "Right now, I need every hand that isn't treating a patient clearing this bay. There could be more of them." It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty rooted in 12 years of pattern recognition, and within 90 seconds, it proved correct. A radio crackled on the belt of one of the restrained pharmacy raiders, the one Marcus Deal had been zip-tied beside for the better part of 20 minutes. A voice came through, tense and clipped. "Primary breach failed. Fallback protocol. Charge is set. 10 minutes to detonation. Full building. Everyone clear the north wing." Sarah's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with focus. "There's a second device," she said, loud enough to cut through the chaos of the bay. "Full building charge. 10 minutes. Marcus Deal, still zip-tied on the floor near the pharmacy corridor, went white as paper. "You're joking," he said. "Please tell me you're joking." Nobody answered him. Nobody had time. Sarah grabbed the restrained man's radio off his belt, ignoring his muffled protest, and clicked it once. "This is Sarah Whitfield. I don't know who's listening on this channel, but your op is compromised. Your primary and secondary targets are secure, your assault team is in custody, and you have a building full of federal officers about to converge on your position. Detonating now buys you nothing but a murder charge. Think about that before you push the button." Silence answered her for 3 full seconds, long enough for Dr. Alvarez to grab her arm. Then the radio crackled back to life, a different voice this time, older, calmer, the voice of someone used to giving orders from a safe distance. "You don't understand the situation," the voice said. "The charge isn't a threat. It's a contingency. It goes off whether you evacuate or not. All you're buying yourself is time to get people clear." "Then why tell me that?" Sarah said, "instead of just letting it happen?" A pause. "Because whoever you are, you already took down 4 of my men and disarmed my assault. I respect competence when I see it. Consider it professional courtesy. You have 9 minutes. The radio went dead. Sarah stood very still for exactly 1 second, filing that voice away, The accent, the cadence, the strange formal cruelty of it. The way a soldier files away a threat for later, instead of letting it distract from the immediate one. "Sarah, we need to evacuate now. We don't have time to negotiate with—" "I know," Sarah said, and was already moving. "That's exactly what we're going to do. Full evacuation, north wing first, then work outward. I need a head count of every patient who can't self-transport, starting now." The next 4 minutes moved like a fever dream for everyone in that ER except Sarah Whitfield, who moved through it with a calm that bordered on unsettling, directing staff, coordinating gurney teams, assigning nurses to non-ambulatory patients, with an efficiency that no amount of hospital training had ever produced in anyone on that floor. Dr. Alvarez found herself simply obeying, the way 100 confused, frightened people obey the one person in the room who sounds like they know exactly what they're doing, because in this moment, only one person did. "Bay 6, Bay 7, cardiac patients first," Sarah called out. "Non-ambulatory to the service elevators, not the main bank. They're faster and further from the blast radius estimate. Ambulatory patients out the south exit, away from the loading dock." A young orderly named Kevin froze near a gurney, hands shaking too hard to release the wheel locks. Sarah reached him in 3 strides, released the locks herself, and put a hand on his shoulder. "Push," she said, not unkindly. "You can shake and push at the same time. Go." He went. Marcus Deal, still zip-tied, watched all of this from the floor with an expression that had curdled from fear into something closer to shame. "Cut him loose," Sarah said to a passing marshal, nodding at Deal. "He's not a threat, and every hand counts right now." The marshal sliced the zip tie, and Deal scrambled to his feet, rubbing his wrists, staring at Sarah with wide, uncomprehending eyes. "You're helping me?" he said. "After everything I don't have time for that conversation," Sarah said. "Grab a wheelchair, room 214, elderly female, can't walk unassisted. Go." Deal went, because in that moment, there was nothing else in him capable of doing anything other than what the voice in front of him told him to do. At the 7-minute mark, Sarah found the pharmacy corridor again, this time alone, moving fast and low, because evacuation would only matter if the device didn't go off at all, and she had spent 12 years learning that some problems could not be solved by running away from them fast enough. She found the device wedged behind a supply rack near the loading dock, a compact charge wired to a countdown timer, glowing red numbers in the dark, 6 minutes, 40 seconds, and dropping. Sarah's stomach didn't drop with it. Her hands went still, steady, the same stillness that had once disarmed a pressure plate device in a Kandahar compound, with 3 children asleep in the next room. She didn't have EOD certification. She'd never claimed to. But 12 years in the field taught every operator enough to recognize commercial components when she saw them, and this device had been built fast, built for intimidation as much as destruction, wired with more anger than expertise. Behind her, footsteps. She spun, hand already reaching for a fire extinguisher on the wall, and found Dr. Alvarez in the doorway breathing hard. "I told everyone to evacuate," Sarah said. "That includes you." "I'm not leaving you down here alone with a bomb," Alvarez said. "Tell me what to do." Sarah almost smiled. Almost. "Get me the maintenance shutoff for this floor's electrical panel," she said. "Now. 3rd door on the left." Alvarez ran. Sarah knelt beside the device, 5 minutes and counting, and traced the wiring with the tip of a pen she'd pulled from her scrub pocket, careful never to touch the components directly. 2 wires ran to the timer. A 3rd ran to what looked like a cell signal receiver, a remote failsafe in case someone wanted to trigger it manually rather than wait out the clock. That receiver was the key. Cut the signal, and whoever was watching lost their remote option. The timer would still run, but at least the device couldn't be triggered early by panic on the other end. Alvarez returned at the 3-minute mark, breathless, with a maintenance key in hand. "Cut the power to this floor," Sarah said. "All of it. Now." Alvarez didn't ask why. She ran the key into the panel and through the master switch, and the corridor went dark, except for the red glow of the countdown, which flickered, stuttered, and kept counting, because battery-powered devices didn't care about building power. But the cell signal receiver's small indicator light died instantly. "That's the remote trigger gone," Sarah said, mostly to herself. "Now it's just a clock. 2 minutes, 14 seconds. Sarah had diffused exactly one device like this in her career, years ago, in a country she wasn't allowed to name, under the supervision of an EOD tech who had walked her through it wire by wire while her hands shook worse than they were shaking now. For half a second, the pharmacy corridor fell away, and she was somewhere else entirely. A rooftop in Djibouti 2 years ago, sand-colored buildings stretching toward a bruised evening sky. Reyes crouched beside her, breathing hard, blood on his sleeve from a graze he wouldn't admit hurt. Kowalski at the stairwell door, weapon steady. Dunmore and Petrov moving through the compound below, voices low and clipped over the comms. Extraction point compromised. The radio had crackled. A voice she trusted completely, a voice that had given her the coordinates for the extraction herself. Package secure. Proceed to Rally Point Bravo. She had made the call in 4 seconds. Rally Point Bravo. She had trusted the intelligence because trusting the intelligence was the job, because second-guessing every order in the field got people killed faster than following bad ones. Rally Point Bravo had been waiting for them. Not friendlies, not extraction. An ambush built on a leak nobody had told her existed, 3 levels above her pay grade. In a chain of command, she'd never had reason to doubt until the night it cost her 4 names she would carry for the rest of her life. She had not frozen that night. She had fought her way out with 2 survivors and a wound in her shoulder that had taken 11 months to fully heal. And she had spent every day since believing the 4 seconds it took her to say, proceed to Rally Point Bravo, was the moment she had failed the people who trusted her most. The pharmacy corridor snapped back into focus. Concrete floor, red numbers counting down. Dr. Alvarez's flashlight trembling in her grip. She did not have the time to relive Djibouti. She had never had the time. That was the whole problem with carrying it alone for 3 years. Grief didn't wait for a convenient moment, and neither did the work in front of her. She did not have him beside her tonight, the EOD tech from that other rooftop, that other country. She had a stopwatch counting down, and a doctor gripping a flashlight with white knuckles. There's a secondary lock on the detonator housing, Sarah said, working the small casing with her pen, forcing it open with more care than speed. If I cut the wrong wire, it goes early. If I do nothing, it goes on schedule anyway, so I might as well try. Sarah, don't talk. Hold the light steady. 1 minute, 40 seconds. Sarah studied the wiring for 3 of the longest seconds of her life, running through a decision tree built from a training pipeline that had cost the government millions of dollars and cost her personally more than money could measure. Red wire to the timer. Black wire to the battery. A thin yellow wire running to what looked like a secondary blasting cap. Redundant. Built by someone who wanted to make absolutely sure this thing went off even if the primary failed. Cut the yellow wire first. If it was a decoy, nothing happened. If it wasn't, it bought her the only chance she had. 1 minute, 10 seconds. Sarah cut the yellow wire. The countdown display flickered, stuttered, and froze at 1 minute, 4 seconds, its numbers locked, unmoving, the small mechanism inside it going dark and silent. For 3 full seconds, nobody in that corridor breathed. Then Dr. Alvarez let out a sound that was half sob and half laugh, and sat down hard on the concrete floor, flashlight still clutched in shaking hands. Sarah exhaled slowly, the first full breath she'd allowed herself in 6 minutes, and looked at the frozen numbers with something that wasn't quite relief, because relief implied the danger was over. And 12 years of experience had taught her that danger like this never fully ended. It just moved to the next building, the next night, the next person foolish enough to think they were safe. We need this device photographed, bagged, and handed to whatever federal agency shows up first, she said, voice already steadying back into clinical calm. And we need to get back upstairs. There are still people who need care. Alvarez looked up at her from the floor. You just disarmed a bomb with a pen. I got lucky, Sarah said. That wasn't luck. Sarah didn't answer, because there was no answer that wouldn't require explaining 12 years of a life she'd buried under 3 years of silence. And she wasn't ready, not yet, to hand that explanation to anyone, even someone who had just watched her save all of their lives. By the time they climbed back to the main floor, the building had gone from evacuation chaos to a different kind of chaos entirely, the kind that arrived in black SUVs and government sedans, the kind that carried badges instead of stethoscopes. A woman in a dark suit stood near the nurses' station, flanked by 2 men who moved like they'd spent their careers standing exactly where they were standing now, watching everything, saying nothing. Sarah Whitfield, the woman said, reading from a tablet in her hand. though her eyes never left Sarah's face. Or should I say, Senior Chief Petty Officer Whitfield, United States Navy, retired. The words landed in the crowded ER like a second detonation, quieter than the first, but somehow louder in every way that mattered. Marcus Deal, still holding a wheelchair he'd pushed to safety 20 minutes earlier, went very still. Petty Officer, he repeated, like the words didn't fit in his mouth. Navy. Senior Chief? The woman in the suit corrected, not unkindly. There's a difference, and she earned every letter of it. My name is Agent Diane Castellano, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I've been trying to reach you for 18 months, Miss Whitfield. You're a hard woman to find when you don't want to be found. Sarah stood very still in the middle of the ruined ER bay, blood on her scrubs that wasn't hers, a hospital full of witnesses staring at her like she'd grown a second head, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in 3 years, the particular, unbearable weight of being seen. I wasn't hiding, Sarah said, though they both knew that was a lie. You changed your legal name, moved 4 times in 18 months, and took a nursing job under a background that took my analysts 6 weeks to verify wasn't fabricated, Castellano said. That's not exactly an open book, Senior Chief. What do you want from me? Tonight? Nothing you haven't already given this hospital. A statement, eventually, when things calm down. But there's something else. Castellano's expression shifted, softened slightly. There's a board of inquiry that's been sitting on the Djibouti incident for 2 years. New intelligence came in 8 months ago. Signals traffic that puts the blame for that compromised extraction somewhere other than where you've apparently decided to put it yourself. Sarah's whole body went rigid. That's not what happened, she said. That's exactly what happened, Castellano said. The extraction point was compromised before your team ever reached that rooftop. Somebody sold the location. It wasn't your call that got Reyes, Kowalski, Dunmore, and Petrov killed. It was a leak in the chain 3 levels above your pay grade, and it took 2 years and a court-martial nobody's heard about yet to prove it. Whose leak? Sarah said, and the question came out sharper than she intended. 12 years of discipline barely holding the edge off her voice. A logistics officer who's currently in pre-trial confinement at Leavenworth, Castellano said. He sold coordinates to a contractor network operating in the region, the same kind of network, as it turns out, that just tried to silence a federal witness in a Colorado hospital. Tonight isn't unconnected to that night, Senior Chief. It's the same rot, different continent, still trying to profit off compromised intelligence and dead operators nobody was supposed to ask questions about. Sarah felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, not from fear this time, but from the particular vertigo of watching a 3-year-old certainty dissolve into something else entirely. You could have told me 18 months ago, she said. We tried, Castellano said. You changed your name. You moved 4 times. You buried yourself so deep in a nursing career that it took my analysts 6 weeks just to confirm you were still alive, let alone find you. I'm not blaming you for that, Senior Chief. I'm telling you it's why I'm standing in this ER at 2 in the morning instead of calling your old CO to deliver the news secondhand. The names hit Sarah like physical blows. 4 names she'd been carrying alone in the shower for 3 years. 4 names she'd built an entire second life around punishing herself for. You're telling me it wasn't my fault, she said, and her voice for the first time all night cracked, just slightly. Just enough for the people standing nearby to hear the human being underneath 12 years of training. I'm telling you the Navy owes you an apology it doesn't know how to give yet, Castellano said. And I'm telling you that tonight, in this building, you just proved exactly why some of us have spent 2 years trying to bring you back in instead of just letting you disappear into civilian life. Sarah stood in the wreckage of the ER, surrounded by patients she'd saved and colleagues who were only now understanding who they'd been working beside for 3 years, and felt the careful architecture of her hidden life come apart completely, piece by piece, in front of dozens of witnesses who would never see her the same way again. Dr. Alvarez stepped forward, still holding the flashlight from the pharmacy corridor. She just disarmed a bomb with a pen and stopped an armed assault with her bare hands, Alvarez said to Castellano. Whatever you people need from her, she's earned the right to say no. Castellano's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Noted, Doctor, and for the record, I agree. Marcus Deal, still standing near the wheelchair, cleared his throat, voice small in a way nobody had ever heard from him before. I called you a liability, he said to Sarah, 3 days ago, to the board. I said you were hiding something and it made you a security risk. You weren't wrong, Sarah said. I was hiding something. But you saved this building tonight. You saved all of us. And I spent 3 years trying to get you fired for being exactly the reason we're all still alive. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face softened, just slightly, the way ice softens at the very edges before it decides whether to hold or break. You were scared and insecure, and you took it out on the person who scared you the most, she said. That's not an excuse, but it's not unforgivable either. What matters is what you do with tonight. Deal nodded, looking for the first time since Sarah had met him, genuinely small. The next hour blurred into the particular chaos of aftermath. Statements taken, patients accounted for. The 2 escaped gunmen apprehended 6 blocks away by responding police units who'd been given a description that matched exactly nothing they expected from a hospital robbery call. Alexei Rusev loaded into a federal transport van with his wrist in a splint, and his career, whatever remained of it, effectively over. Daniel Cho came out of surgery 2 hours later, stable, expected to make a full recovery, his testimony against the syndicate that had tried to kill him now backed by an entire federal case against whoever had leaked his protective custody location. A case that Agent Castellano promised would eventually connect back to the same corrupted channels that had compromised Sarah's team in Djibouti 2 years earlier. Somewhere past 1 in the morning, Sarah found herself back in the stairwell, the one place in the building nobody else used, sitting on the 3rd landing where she'd eaten a protein bar in another life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. Dr. Alvarez found her there 20 minutes later, 2 cups of hospital coffee in hand. You don't have to talk about it, Alvarez said, sitting down beside her. But I'd like to understand who I've been working next to for 3 years, if you're willing. Sarah looked at the coffee, then at her hands, steadier now than they'd been in months. 12 years a SEAL, she said. Senior Chief. I led a team into a compromised extraction that I thought was my failure. I've spent 3 years punishing myself for 4 deaths that apparently weren't mine to carry. That's a lot to carry alone. I didn't know how to carry it any other way. Alvarez was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, the nurse I've known for 3 years is the same person who just saved this entire building tonight. Whatever else you are, that part was never a disguise. Sarah felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, for the first time in longer than she could remember. I don't know what happens now, she said. Nobody ever does, Alvarez said. But you don't have to figure it out alone this time. That's the part you got wrong for 3 years. By morning, the story had already reached local news, then national footage of a hospital's shattered ER bay circulating alongside a name that hadn't existed in any headline in 18 months. Reporters camped outside the hospital's main entrance for 2 full days, shouting questions at anyone in scrubs, chasing rumors that had already grown 3 sizes larger than the truth. One network ran a segment calling her the Ghost Nurse. Another dug up a blurry photo from a decommissioned Navy website and ran it beside the words hero or hidden weapon, a headline Sarah refused to read past. Priya, the young nurse who'd been thrown into a supply rack during the blast, found Sarah in the break room on the 2nd day, holding her phone out with a nervous half-smile. They want to interview staff, Priya said. Anybody who was there. I told them no. I figured you'd want that. Thank you, Sarah said, and meant it more than the words could carry. For what it's worth, Priya added, I always thought there was something about the way you moved. I just thought you used to be a dancer or something. Sarah almost laughed, the first real laugh she'd allowed herself in days. Close enough, she said. Sarah Whitfield declined every interview request. But the hospital administration, faced with a board meeting they could no longer avoid, called her into a conference room 3 days later. The hospital's CEO, a measured man named Gerald Finch, who had spent the entire crisis 2 states away at a conference and returned to a public relations disaster and a genuine hero in the same building, sat across from her with Agent Castellano and, to Sarah's mild surprise, Marcus Deal, who had asked to be present. The board wants to offer you something, Finch said. A position, Director of Emergency Preparedness and Tactical Medical Response. You design and run a program training our entire trauma staff in exactly what you did 3 nights ago, on a scale that could save lives in situations no hospital protocol currently prepares for. Sarah looked at the offer letter on the table, then at Deal, who met her eyes without flinching for the first time since she'd met him. "I recommended you for it," Deal said, "for what that's worth coming from me." "It's worth something," Sarah said. "It means you learned something this week." "I did," Deal said. "I learned that the people who look the quietest are usually carrying the most, and I spent 3 years making that harder for you instead of easier." "I'm sorry." Sarah studied the offer letter. 12 years of buried identity finally being asked for the first time to stand fully in the light instead of hiding in the seams of a disguise. "There's a Navy Board of Inquiry that wants to clear my name," she said to Castellano. "What happens to that if I take this?" "Nothing has to happen to it," Castellano said. "You can do both. The Navy owes you a correction to the record, whether you wear the uniform again or not. This job doesn't cancel that out. If anything, it proves exactly what you're capable of when you stop hiding it." Sarah thought of Reyes, Kowalski, Dunmore, and Petrov, 4 names she would carry for the rest of her life, not as guilt now, but as reason, the weight of them shifting from something that crushed her into something that steadied her, the way a keel steadies a ship instead of sinking it. She thought of Harold Betts, telling her she had a soldier's hands. She thought of the girl in Bay 6 who'd stayed silent and still because a stranger's changed voice had told her to trust it. She thought of Dr. Alvarez, sitting beside her on a stairwell landing at 1 in the morning, refusing to let her carry any of it alone. "I'll take the position," Sarah said, "on one condition. The program trains nurses, not just to survive an active threat, but to lead through one, the way I had to learn to lead through mine, alone, for 3 years, because nobody built a program that could have prepared me for a night like that one." "Done," Finch said, sliding the paperwork across the table. Sarah signed her name, her real name, for the first time in 3 years, in a document that didn't require her to disappear. 6 weeks later, the first cohort of Denver Metro's Tactical Medical Response Program graduated in a small ceremony in the hospital atrium. 20 nurses and 2 doctors, who had spent 6 weeks learning triage under simulated fire, hemorrhage control in confined spaces, and the particular calm required to lead a room full of frightened people when every instinct screamed to panic. Kevin, the young orderly who'd frozen at a gurney's wheel locks on the worst night of his life, sat in the front row in scrubs pressed sharp for the occasion. A small bronze pin already fastened to his collar, the same pin every graduate received, a single silent badge, unmarked, unranked, meant to be worn without explanation. "You told me I could shake and push at the same time," Kevin said to her before the ceremony started, voice a little unsteady with pride. "I think about that more than you'd guess." "Everybody shakes," Sarah told him. "The ones who matter push anyway." Sarah stood at the front of that room, in scrubs still bright vivid cobalt blue, but standing straighter now, shoulders back, voice carrying without hesitation, no longer curved small to hide what she was. Marcus Deal sat in the back row, having asked, and been granted, a seat in the very first class as a civilian participant, learning what real competence looked like from the woman he'd once tried to have fired. Dr. Alvarez sat in the second row beside Agent Castellano, who had flown back to Denver specifically for the ceremony, a folded set of official orders in a manila envelope tucked under her arm, the formal correction to a 2-year-old record that Sarah had not yet decided what to do with. "Some of you are going to leave this program and never use a single thing you learned here," Sarah told the graduating class, her voice steady, carrying to every corner of the room. "I hope that's true for most of you. I hope you never have to use it." She paused, and for a moment her eyes found an empty space in the crowd where 4 faces existed only in memory. "But some of you will, and when that night comes, you won't have time to become someone new. You'll only have time to be exactly who you already trained to be. That's not about titles, or ranks, or what you hide under a badge or a uniform or a pair of scrubs. It's about what you built in the quiet years nobody was watching. Respect isn't given by a title. It's earned by character, one decision at a time, especially the ones nobody sees." She looked out at the room, at Dr. Alvarez smiling from the second row, at Marcus Deal sitting a little straighter than he used to, at Agent Castellano nodding once from beside him, at a hospital that had learned the hard way that its quietest employee had been carrying more strength than any of them had ever given her credit for. After the ceremony, Castellano found her near the atrium doors, manila envelope still tucked under one arm. "The Board of Inquiry ruling comes through next month," Castellano said. "Officially, on paper, in writing, your record gets corrected. The Navy will want to discuss reinstatement, if you're interested. Full rank, full honors, whatever that's worth after everything. Sarah looked at the envelope for a long moment, then out at the atrium, at nurses in cobalt blue scrubs laughing together near the refreshment table, at Kevin showing off his new pin to anyone who'd look. "Tell them I'm honored," Sarah said, "and tell them I'm needed here for now." "That's not a no." "It's not a no," Sarah agreed. "It's a not yet." Castellano smiled, the first real smile Sarah had seen from her. "I can work with a not yet." And for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Whitfield let herself stand fully in the open. No disguise left to hold, no secret left to bury. Only the work in front of her and the names behind her, finally carried the way they deserved to be carried, not as weight, but as reason. The end. If Sarah's story moved you tonight, hit like and let this channel know these stories matter to you. Drop a comment and tell me which moment hit hardest, the rooftop in Djibouti, the pin against the wires, or the graduation pin nobody explains. Subscribe to Secrets of Silent Badges so you never miss the next quiet hero hiding an extraordinary past. We'll see you in the next story.